I'm very grateful to the Society for for Asian Art for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about ancient Mesopotamia here. I'm going to talk today about death and afterlife in Mesopotamia. And in order to do that, and to put that a little bit in perspective, I want to start by talking about Egypt and Mesopotamia. Egypt and Mesopotamia were two high cultures in around the same time. So they share a number of important characteristics. Both Egypt and Mesopotamia introduced writing at around the same time. But there are also large numbers of very important distinctions and differences between Mesopotamia and Egypt. For Egypt, much of the information that we have today, much of our data, is in one way or another related to death. The most iconic images that we have of ancient Egypt are related to death. Pyramids and sphinxes are essentially enormous tombs. They are mortuary monuments. Coffins are, of course, made in order to hold mummies. And they are beautifully decorated, and they are directly related to the Egyptian conception of death and afterlife. But also the writing on the walls in Egyptian temples is usually related to Egyptian conceptions of death, afterlife, and rebirth. And a beautiful papyrus, like the one that I'm showing here, holds the Book of the Dead, the Egyptian book that talks about the journey of the soul from this world to the netherworld and how the soul has to behave in between. Now the contrast with Mesopotamia, and I'm not a specialist in Egyptian, so I'm just making this up, so to say, but I want to make a contrast here with Mesopotamia. The contrast with Mesopotamia could hardly be larger. Perhaps the most, one thing in between. For Mesopotamia, we also have graves with important grave goods. We have a few very rich graves, comparable to rich graves from Egypt, but we have only two. So in Egypt we have large numbers of rich graves. In Mesopotamia we have only two. One of these was excavated in the city of Ur, and that is in the deep south of Mesopotamia. Let's see. Over here. And those graves are the famous royal graves of Ur that are dated to approximately 2500 BCE. The other set of graves is from Nimrud, over here in Assyria, where the Assyrian queens were buried. And those are dated to approximately 800 BCE. So we have two of those rich sets of graves, one all the way in the south, one all the way in the north. In between there are 1500 years, more than 1500 years, and that is essentially what we have in terms of important rich graves. I will be talking about these graves in more detail at the end of this presentation. The contrast between Egypt, where everything seems to be about death and afterlife, and Mesopotamia could hardly be larger. This may well be the most iconic monumental object from Mesopotamia. It is the so-called Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi is dated around 1800 BCE. We see Mr. Hammurabi standing here, and he is standing in front of the sun god Shamash. In Mesopotamia, the sitting guy is always more important than the one who is standing. Shamash is the god of the sun, but he is also the god of justice. And Hammurabi receives symbols of power that you see here from the sun god. By the way, we know that this is the sun god for many reasons, but also because we see the rays coming out of his shoulder over there. Most iconic monument from Mesopotamia is a law code regulating life. Not regulating death, but regulating life. Excavations in Mesopotamia have unearthed palaces and temples that are related to life. They have unearthed graves, as we were talking about a little earlier, but they are relatively rare. What we do have from Mesopotamia is large numbers of clay tablets, and I will be talking about some of those later on. Those clay tablets are in great majority administrative in nature. The text that you see on the left talks about sheep and goats and hides of sheep and goats that are delivered from one guy to another. An administrative purpose. The text on the right is a letter from one businessman to another. Again, the texts from Mesopotamia are primarily related to life in Mesopotamia. In addition to administrative texts and letters, we also have texts like this. A cultic lament in Sumerian. I will be talking more about Sumerian in a moment. And the fifth tablet of the Gilgamesh epic. This was a tablet that was discovered fairly recently. It was published, I believe, 5 years ago. It was found in the museum in Suleimania in northern Iraq. And it's a very interesting tablet. It talks about Gilgamesh and Enkidu entering the cedar forest before they are going to fight with Humbaba. I'll talk more about that later today. It's a very interesting text because the moment that they enter the cedar forest, that passage was not known before. And as it turns out, when they enter the cedar forest, they marvel at the nature, at the birds chirping and the monkeys playing around there. A very, very interesting passage that we did not know before, but that we do now know from this particular tablet. Now, I will be talking mostly about literary texts today, like the two ones that you see here. But I want to emphasize that literary texts are actually a small minority if you look at the entire corpus of cuneiform text. So we estimate that today we may know about 500,000 cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, like 500,000. And I would think that less than 5% of those could be called literary. 95% of them are either administrative in nature or letters. It is this 5% of text that give us perhaps the most vivid idea of how ancient Mesopotamians thought about death and about the afterlife. But as we will see later on, administrative texts actually also have something to say about death. Before we get on to the main part of this presentation, I want to talk for a few minutes about terminology. Mesopotamia is a term that is not native to Mesopotamia. So nobody in the ancient period would have thought of him or herself as a Mesopotamian. Mesopotamia is actually a Greek term. It means between the rivers, and the rivers that we're talking about are the Euphrates. No, the other one. The Euphrates over here, and the Tigris over here. So the Greek term means the land between the rivers. Mesopotamians would be more likely to talk about Sumer. Sumer is the area in the deep south of what is now Iraq, around a number of important cities, such as Ur and Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh, Nippur here in the north, Umma and Lagash. When we talk about Sumer, we mostly talk about the 3rd millennium. So in the 3rd millennium, Sumerian is the language of this particular area. Sumerian is a living language in the 3rd millennium. It dies out somewhere around the end of the 3rd millennium, around the year 2000. But it continues to be used for like 2 millennia after that as a religious and scholarly language. Let me take a little break. Can everybody follow me well? Yes? Okay, thank you. Next up is Akkad. Akkad is just to the north of Sumer, around the city of Agade. And we do not know where the city of Agade was exactly. It must have been somewhere in the area of present-day Baghdad, but it has not been excavated. We do not know where it is exactly. Now in Akkad, the language was Akkadian. And Akkadian is a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic and Aramaic and a number of other languages. Akkad is primarily important around 2350 when a large empire was created by a king called Sargon the Great. Now, today I will not be talking a whole lot about Sargon the Great or about Akkad or about anything from that period. I mention it here because it is very important for terminological reasons. Today we talk about the languages of Mesopotamia primarily as Sumerian and Akkadian. Sumerian, the most ancient language that is not related to any other language, and Akkadian as a Semitic language. Now, Akkadian is essentially a grab-bag term now for any kind of dialect, for any kind of Babylonian or Assyrian dialect. So if you hear me talking about Akkadian today, I do not necessarily refer to this particular area or this particular period in time, but I talk about anything in Assyrian or in Babylonian. Assyrian and Babylonian are actually quite closely related dialects, but they are still very distinct from each other too. Sumer and Akkad together we can refer to as Babylonia. The heart of Babylonia is, of course, the city of Babylon, over here. Babylonia becomes important in the second millennium and is very, very important in the first millennium. So the heart of it, as I said, is the city of Babylon, but at times Babylonia manages to create enormous empires that cover the entire Near East. Babylonia inherits its cultural heritage from Sumer. Even though the languages are very, very different, they identify with their Sumerian heritage. And then finally we have Assyria up in the north. The heart of Assyria is the city of Assur. Assur is an ancient city, but in its earliest history, it was simply a city or a city-state. It's only in later periods, starting around 1300 BCE, that we can talk about Assyria as a nation-state, as something larger than just the city of Assur. Around 1300, we see the rise of what is called the Middle Assyrian Empire. That becomes a very important political power in the area of the ancient Near East. And in the first millennium, we have the Neo-Assyrian Empire that essentially conquers the entire known world of the time. The Assyrian Empire covered the entire area that you see on this map, but also Egypt. In Assyria, they speak Assyrian, unsurprisingly. And as I said, Assyrian is a dialect of Akkadian. It's closely related to Babylonia. However, when we talk about texts from Assyria are usually in Babylonian. So administrative texts and letters, they were composed in Assyrian, but literary texts were composed in Babylonian. Why is that the case? That is the case because Assyria did not have a literary heritage of its own. So it essentially borrowed the literary heritage from Babylonia, and it regarded the Babylonian dialect as the more elite version of the Akkadian language. Now that leads to some interesting results. So when we talk about Gilgamesh, and I will talk quite a bit about Gilgamesh today, we're talking about the king of Uruk, down here in Babylonia. Most of the clay tablets that we have that talk about Gilgamesh, however, come from Assyria. They come from libraries here in Nineveh and from other places in Assyria. So in Assyria, they celebrate an ancient Babylonian king. I think that's quite interesting. Okay, let's turn then now to the literary sources that we have for talking about death and afterlife in literary sources from Mesopotamia. There we are. I will talk primarily about two interesting and strange and beautiful literary compositions. One in Sumerian, that is called Inanna's Descent, and one in Akkadian, the story of Gilgamesh. To the left, you see the goddess Inanna. We can recognize her, first of all, because of the arrows that come out of her shoulder, but also because she places her foot on a lion. And the lion is one of the symbols of Inanna. On the right we see Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Enkidu is Gilgamesh's servant in some stories, or his friend in other stories, and together they slaughter the bull of heaven. We'll be talking about the bull of heaven. To start us off, I will read to you the first section of Inanna's descent, to give you an impression of the style of a text like that. Here we go. From the great heaven, she set her mind on the great below. From the great heaven, the goddess set her mind on the great below. From the great heaven, Inanna set her mind on the great below. My mistress abandoned heaven, abandoned earth, and descended to the netherworld. Inanna abandoned heaven, abandoned earth, and descended to the netherworld. She abandoned the office of En, that is a kind of priestly office. Abandoned the office of Lagar, another kind of priestly office, and descended to the netherworld. She abandoned the Eanna, her temple, in Uruk, and descended to the netherworld. She abandoned the Emushkalama in Batibira and descended to the netherworld. She abandoned the Giguna in Zabalam and descended to the netherworld. She abandoned the Eshara in Adab and descended to the netherworld. She abandoned the Barak Durgara in Nippur and descended to the netherworld. She abandoned the Gursankalama in Kish and descended to the netherworld. She abandoned the Eulmash in Akkade and descended to the netherworld. She took the 7 divine powers. She collected the divine powers and grasped them in her hand. With the good divine powers, she went on her way. She put a turban, headgear for the open country, on her head. She took a wig for her forehead. She hung small lapis lazuli beads around her neck. And she placed twin egg-shaped beads on her breasts. She covered her body with a pala dress, the garment of ladyship. She placed mascara, which is called "Let a man come, let him come," on her eyes. And she pulled the pectoral, which is called "Come man, come," over her breasts. She placed a golden ring on her hand, and she held the lapis lazuli measuring rod and measuring line in her hand. If you hadn't noticed, Sumerian literary texts like to repeat stuff. And we'll get more of that. Okay, so Inanna is ready to go. Please notice that she never tells us why she wants to go to the netherworld. She's ready to go, and she then instructs her minister Ninshubur. And she tells her minister Ninshubur that she should lament for her. Once she has descended into the netherworld, Ninshubur should lament for her. And she should then go to Enlil, the supreme god of the Sumerian pantheon, to ask for help. And if Enlil does not help, she should go to Nanna, the moon god, also a very important god, and ask him for help. And if Nanna does not help, then she should go to Enki, a trickster god, and ask him for help. And Enki, she says, Enki knows about the life-giving plants and the life-giving water. And he is the one who will restore me to life. So this is still in the instructions to Ninshubu, right? Before Inanna actually descends into the netherworld. So Inanna proceeds then to the gates of the netherworld and aggressively asks to be let in. And the doorman asks Ereshkigal, who is the queen of the netherworld and also the sister of Inanna. He asks Ereshkigal what he should do. And he gets instructions from Ereshkigal. She tells him that the doorman should let him in, should let her in, should let Inanna in. But he should let her remove an article of clothing at every gate. And it's pretty clear from the story that both the doorman and Ereshkigal are afraid. They are scared. So Inanna goes through the 7 gates of the netherworld, and she removes clothing and jewelry at each of those 7 gates, and she finally arrives in the netherworld naked. She then takes the throne from her sister and sits on it. But once she is seated, the Anunna, the great gods of the netherworld, they are angry at her. They kill her and hang her corpse on a hook on the wall. Now, all of this is already pretty mysterious, if you ask me. Before Inanna descends, she tells her minister to get help. And so apparently she already knows that this is a story that's not going to have a happy end. That descending into the netherworld is not a good idea. But still she does it. And she tells Ninshubu to get help. She even tells her to go first to Enlil and then to Nanna, even though apparently she knows that she needs to go to Enki in order to get water of life and the plant of life. It's getting a little stranger now. It seems pretty clear from the story that Inanna is power hungry, and that also fits very well with what we know about Inanna. She is power hungry and she wants to replace Ereshkigal, her sister, as the ruler, as the queen of the netherworld. And she actually succeeds in doing so. She sits on that throne ever so briefly. Okay, things are getting stranger. Ninshubur, Inanna's minister, does what she had been asked. She goes to Enlil and she goes to Nanna, and both of them refuse to help. And then she goes to Enki and he promises to help. He takes some dirt from under his fingernails and creates the Galatur and the Kurgara. I'll talk about those two. Now, dirt is very much associated with mourning. And so is the Galatur. The Galatur is essentially a professional mourner. The Kurgara is something like a ritual swordsman, a ritual fighter. And both the Galatur and the Kurgara are usually associated with Inanna. So it seems that at this place the story gives you sort of an origin story of where the Galatur and the Kurgara, who are associated with Inanna, where they come from. They come from Enki. He created them from the dirt under his fingernails. Enki sends them to the netherworld, but they are not supposed to go through the gates, or they are not supposed to go through the gates officially. They flit past the doors, as the text says. And Enki gives them precise instructions what to do once they get to the netherworld. They will see Ereshkigal, the queen of the netherworld, wailing. And the Galatur and the Kurgara are supposed to empathize. So these are the instructions. Oh, this is the piece of where Inanna gets killed. I sort of skipped that, I'm afraid. So the Anuna, the 7 judges, rendered their decision against her. They looked at her. It was the look of death. They spoke to her. It was a speech of anger. They shouted at her. It was the shout of heavy guilt. The afflicted woman was turned into a corpse, and the corpse was hung on a hook. Okay, here then we get to Enki's instructions. What are the Galatur and the Kurgara supposed to do? When she, that is Ereshkigal, says, "Oh, my heart," you are to say, "You are troubled, my mistress. Oh, your heart." And when she says, "Oh, my body," you are to say, "You are troubled, my mistress. Oh, your body." I find this very interesting for one particular reason. It's not like a heroic tale that we have here. It's not like they have to get Inanna by force. They get Inanna by flattery. It's by flattery that they get something done from Ereshkigal here. I'll talk more about that. So by doing this, they are supposed to gain Ereshkigal's trust. And then she will offer them a river full of water or a field full of grain. That is still in Enki's instructions. He knows that. But they are not supposed to accept. Enki instructs them to ask for the corpse hanging from a hook on the wall, the corpse of Inanna. And he sends them out with the life-giving plants and the life-giving water so that they can actually bring Inanna back to life. The Galatura and the Kurgara do exactly as they have been told. And they do bring Inanna back to life. As I said, Sumerian literature really loves repetition. So we get these long instructions by Enki, and then we get the same story all over again, saying that they actually did what Enki instructed them to do. Yeah. The Galatura and the Kurgara bring Inanna back to life, but then when Inanna intends to leave the netherworld, she is stopped. She will have to provide a substitute for herself. Inanna is then accompanied by a group of scary demons who will make sure that they get a substitute to bring back to the netherworld. Once back in the regular world then, they meet various gods who had been wailing for Inanna. And Inanna refuses to give those gods to the demons. But finally they meet Dumutsi, Inanna's husband or lover. Usually he is her lover. And Dumutsi was playing the flute and having a good time. And in her rage, Inanna then gives him as her substitute to the demons. An action that she almost immediately bitterly regrets. So in the end, a kind of compromise is found. Dumuzi will dwell in the netherworld for half a year, and the other half of the year his sister, Inanna, will take his place. And usually that has been interpreted as representing the two seasons, the summer and the winter. So far then my summary of the story of Inanna's descent. Now what are we going to make of that strange story? And what does it tell us about the netherworld in ancient Mesopotamia? I think it tells us primarily this: there is no escape from the netherworld. Death is final and there is no way back. Now perhaps that is not a very enlightening point. We all know that, right? We hardly need a story to teach us about the finality of death. But the story does it in a very particular and very forceful way by its choice of characters and plot. Inanna is not just another goddess. There are thousands upon thousands of divinities in ancient Mesopotamia. But Inanna is by far the most powerful female deity that we know about. She is the goddess of physical love and war. She is depicted as a tender young lady enjoying the embrace of her lover Dumuzi. But she is also described as a vengeful and willful warrior who will destroy whatever comes in her way and will throw a tantrum if things do not go her way. That it is Inanna who ventures on this journey to the netherworld should not surprise anyone. Her goal, that is never explicitly stated in the text, her goal is apparently to conquer new territory at the expense of her sister, Ereshkigal. But the text makes clear that brute force, the kind of brute force that Inanna can muster, that is not going to do much here. Inanna, with all her power, ends up as a corpse hanging from the wall. Inanna is often described as a transgressing character, one who ignores boundaries. And that is exactly what she is doing here in this particular story. It's interesting to note, as I already hinted at before, that the way that Inanna is rescued, the way in which she eventually finds a way out of the netherworld, is not by brute force. It's rather by flattery and by trickery. The Kalatura and the Kurgara, created for this purpose by Enki, are not using heroics. They are empathizing with Queen Ereshkigal, using soft power, so to say, as a way to get something done. Even Inanna then, the powerful goddess, cannot force her own way out of death. The story emphasizes this impossibility of returning from death by relating a counterexample. In fact, the netherworld, which has many, many different names in Sumerian, is most often referred to as the land of no return. The story of Inanna's descent, as I just summarized that for you, does not dwell much on what the netherworld actually looks like, or what life in the netherworld looks like. There is an Akkadian version of essentially the same story that is a little bit more forthcoming in that regard. This version is referred to as Ishtar's descent to the netherworld. Ishtar is the same goddess as Inanna. Ishtar is her Akkadian name, and Inanna is her Sumerian name. The opening passage of that text describes the netherworld as a dreary place. To the netherworld, land of no return, Ishtar, daughter of Sin, the moon god, set her mind. Indeed, the daughter of Sin did set her mind to the gloomy house, seat of the netherworld, to the house which no one leaves who enters, to the road whose journey has no return, to the house whose entrance are bereft of light, where dust is their sustenance and clay their food. They see no light but dwell in darkness. They are clothed like birds in wings for garments, and dust has gathered on the door and the bolt. Oh, this dramatic and somewhat unpleasant description of the netherworld is actually repeated in two other very different literary texts. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, that we will be talking about in a minute, and in the strange love story of Nergal and Ereshkigal. So it seems that scribes found this passage an apt description of the netherworld, emphasizing again the fact that no one can return, but also providing a rather gloomy and unattractive image of existence after death. And the question that we may have to return to is, can we hold this passage up as sort of a brief summary of the existence after death in Babylonia or in Mesopotamia? Is this a representative image of what they thought about life after death? I'll turn now to the Gilgamesh story. Before I can say much about Gilgamesh, we first have to think about what is that really, the Gilgamesh story. As it turns out, there are a number of different stories around Gilgamesh. First of all, there are 5 Sumerian Gilgamesh stories. And we'll talk about each of those briefly. And then there is what we call the Gilgamesh Epic in Akkadian. But the Gilgamesh Epic is also hardly one text. It is a text, as you can see here, that existed for more than 1500 years and that developed over time. It changed. So when we talk about the Gilgamesh Epic, we're not talking about one text, we're rather talking about a series of versions of the adventures of Gilgamesh. I'll first talk about the Sumerian stories. There are 5 of them. 4 of them have sometimes been interpreted as belonging together as sort of a cycle of stories. And we'll talk about these briefly. First, Gilgamesh, Enkidu and the Netherworld is a story about Gilgamesh playing a kind of ball game. A kind of hockey, perhaps. And he plays with the inhabitants of Uruk, of the city that he is king of. And at one point, the inhabitants don't think it is a whole lot of fun anymore. They are sort of harried by Gilgamesh. And they pray to the gods, and the gods make the puck and the ball fall into the netherworld. And Gilgamesh is sort of devastated. He doesn't know what to do. And he asks whether someone would be willing to go into the netherworld and retrieve the ball and the puck. And Enkidu is the one who says yes, he will do that. There are a couple of adventures around that are not really relevant right now. What is relevant is that at some point Enkidu actually returns from the netherworld with the help of the sun god. And when he returns from the netherworld, Gilgamesh asks him, "What did you see there?" And Enkidu talks about different types of human beings that he saw there. He saw the man who had only one son. No, he saw the man who had no sons at all. And that man bitterly complains. And he saw a man who had only one son, and he is very poor in the netherworld. And that goes all the way to the man who has 7 sons, and he is rich, and he is very happy in the netherworld. But all in all, the picture that Enkidu gives you from existence in the netherworld is again not a very happy one. With the exception of the little children that never lived. They are playing at the golden table and are having fun. But for other people, life in the netherworld doesn't seem to be much fun. Gilgamesh and Huwawa is again a story about Gilgamesh and Enkidu. They go out to fight the monster Huwawa in the cedar forest. Okay. That was Huwawa, I think, by the roaring of Huwawa, I think. But we can get back to the story now. Gilgamesh and Enkidu go out to fight Huwawa. That story is not of much interest to us right now, but what is of interest is why they go out to kill Huwawa. And the story talks about that very explicitly. Do I have that on the slide? Yes. Enkidu, since a man cannot pass beyond the final end of life, I want to set off into the mountains to establish my renown there. Where renown can be established there, I will establish my renown. And where no renown can be established there, I shall establish the renown of the gods. Going into the mountains and killing Huwawa, the main reason for that is that life has an end. And that death is coming inevitably. And Gilgamesh wants to make a name for himself. The third of our stories, Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven, does not seem to relate in any way very much to the issue of death. But we also do not know a whole lot about this story, frankly, because it is transmitted to us only in a rather fragmentary fashion. Finally, the last of these 4 stories is the death of Gilgamesh, and that is a very interesting one in talking about death and afterlife. When the death of Gilgamesh starts is where Gilgamesh is laying on his deathbed. He is ill and he cannot get up anymore. And he has a dream. And in this dream he sees the council of the gods. And the council of the gods is discussing his fate. And there are basically 2 parties. An and Enlil, 2 of the main gods, they argue that Gilgamesh's accomplishments are so great and so extraordinary that they should not let him die. That they should let him live. But Enki, on the other hand, argues that they had decided a long time ago that no human being would live forever. That human beings have to die and that only gods can live forever. And they should stick to that principle. And Enkidu wins his case, and so the gods decide that Gilgamesh has to die. And Gilgamesh is truly frightened. Now, as Sumerian stories go, this whole passage, this long passage of some 100 lines, is repeated. And it's repeated because the whole dream comes true. The gods actually gather in council and decide about Gilgamesh's fate. And they decide that he has to die. And Gilgamesh is frightened, very frightened. It's only after Gilgamesh's son, who is called Ur-Lugal, it is only when Ur-Lugal builds a monument for him, a mortuary monument, and inscribes Gilgamesh's name on that monument, that Gilgamesh accepts his fate and goes to the netherworld, enters the netherworld in peace. Final story on this list is Gilgamesh and Aga. I will not talk about that because it deals with entirely different themes. So these Sumerian Gilgamesh stories offer a remarkable contemplation on the fate of all human beings and the role of fame and family in dealing with death. When Enkidu returns from the netherworld, what he has to tell is not pretty. When Ur-Lugal, the son of Gilgamesh, builds a monument for Gilgamesh, that seems to be a solution to Gilgamesh's problem. What the Sumerian Gilgamesh stories seem to tell you is that not even Gilgamesh, not even this big hero, can escape death. Not even Gilgamesh can escape the fear of death. But family rituals, celebrating the community of the living and the dead, that holds everything together. You may be more familiar with the so-called Epic of Gilgamesh. We've seen that, yes. You may be more familiar with the so-called Epic of Gilgamesh in Akkadian. As I mentioned earlier, the Epic of Gilgamesh has a long history, a history of more than 1500 years. Am I coming through well? It sounds to me like there is some strange noise. No? It's good? Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Move the mic. Is that? Am I still? Yeah? Okay, thank you. We usually distinguish between the Old Babylonian version, that is the first version of the Gilgamesh epic, dated to around 1800 BCE. But as you can see, I talk about Old Babylonian versions in the plural. So that means there is no real standard text around this period. Someone who writes the Gilgamesh epic makes up his own epic. They are all very, very similar to each other, but in details they are different. In the Middle Babylonian period, that is around 1300 BCE, that is still the case. So we still find rather different versions of the Gilgamesh story in different places in the ancient Near East. Around 1100, the Gilgamesh epic is standardized. That is, everything that we find after 1100, more or less, is the same. We find the 11 tablets of the Gilgamesh epic in Babylonia and in Assyria, and they essentially tell us the same story. with little differences maybe, but essentially the same. Now, clay tablets are always broken, and the Epic of Gilgamesh is a long text in 11 chapters, and that means that if you read a modern translation of the Gilgamesh epic, what you read, in fact, are bits and pieces from all of these versions put together as if it were a single text. So that makes it a bit complicated to talk about what is the Epic of Gilgamesh really. But today I will give you a summary of what we believe is going on in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the standard version, the Gilgamesh epic has 11 tablets, and that means 11 chapters. In the introduction, we are told that Gilgamesh is the wise, strong, and beautiful king of Uruk. And I believe I have part of the introduction here for you. He who saw the deep, the foundation of the country, who knew the proper ways and was wise in all matters. Gilgamesh, who saw the deep, the foundation of the country, who knew the proper ways, was wise in all matters. He explored everywhere the seats of power. He knew the totality of wisdom about all things. He saw the secret and uncovered the hidden. He brought back a message from before the flood. I quote this introduction to you because it's strange. It is very, very strange. What we are told here is that Gilgamesh is sort of a wisdom hero. He is the wisest of all people. He knew everything. Now we get into the story and we learn that he is not wise at all. We learn that from his actions, we learn that he is absolutely not a wise king. So where the story starts is the story of Gilgamesh the tyrant. He oppresses the people of his city. He sleeps with the brides and he makes the men work until they fall dead. And so the women of the town, they complain and they ask the gods to do something about it. And the gods do something about it. They create Enkidu. And Enkidu is to become the counterpart of Gilgamesh. They create Enkidu by throwing a piece of clay into the wild. And Enkidu initially is a wild man and he has to be introduced into society step by step. The first step in that is actually they send out a prostitute and the prostitute and Enkidu have sex with each other for 7 days and 7 nights. And that is the first step in becoming a real human being. Enkidu also learns how to eat properly and how to drink properly, and he becomes a true human being and he enters into Uruk. And because by now he is a true human being, he also has morality. And when he sees what Gilgamesh does, that is sleeping with the brides, he is outraged. And Gilgamesh and Enkidu have a fight. And if we understand the text well, the fight really does not have a winner. They simply exhaust each other. But after that fight, they become friends. They have this very deep friendship and they go on adventures together. So the taming of Enkidu, I talked about that. That is tablet 2, and then in tablet 3 they plan to fight Humbaba. And Humbaba is of course the same figure as Huwawa in the Sumerian stories. So tablet 3 talks about the preparations for fighting Humbaba in the cedar forest. In tablet 4, the two friends then travel to the cedar forest. So the whole chapter there is only about the travel from Uruk to the cedar forest. It seems that in the story, time comes to a standstill. The whole story is about the dreams that Gilgamesh has. These are nightmares about encountering Humbaba. And Enkidu has to explain to Gilgamesh that these dreams are actually favorable dreams, that he will win the fight. And what this tablet makes very, very clear is that Humbaba is a terrifying monster, a very dangerous and terrifying monster. In tablet 5, then, they enter the cedar forest, and we've seen one of the tablets that talks about entering the cedar forest, and they have to fight with Humbaba, and yes, they win, and they kill Humbaba. And the gods don't seem to be so pleased with that, frankly. They kill Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest. They come back to Uruk in glory. They've won their fight. And Gilgamesh washes his weapons in the sea. And at that point, Ishtar comes by and she falls in love with Gilgamesh. Ishtar, the powerful goddess, a goddess of Uruk, falls in love with Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk. And she proposes to him. She wants to marry Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh not only refuses, but he actually starts insulting her. He starts insulting her, talking about all of her previous lovers whose fate was not all that great. And Ishtar is enraged, and she goes up to her father, Anu in heaven, and she requests from him the bull of heaven. And initially Anu refuses because he knows that the bull of heaven will ravage earth, but then Ishtar throws a tantrum and he gives in. And so Ishtar takes down the bull of heaven to earth, and it starts destroying Uruk and the area around Uruk. Gilgamesh and Enkidu enter the fight, and they manage to kill the bull of heaven. And then they insult Ishtar even more by throwing a thigh of the bull at her. And that is the point where the gods decide that they've had enough. That is too much for them to bear. And one of them, Gilgamesh or Enkidu, will have to die. And they decide that it is Enkidu who will have to die. And that is the big turning point in the story, why I drew that line. Where the first half of the story is about heroic adventures, the second half of the story seems to be about an inner journey of Gilgamesh dealing with the death of his friend, as well as with his own death that he knows will come. So the death of Enkidu is related in tablet 7, by itself a very interesting section of the text. In tablet 8 we get this grandiose funeral of Enkidu. Unfortunately, very little of that tablet is preserved, but enough is preserved to see that Enkidu, who was born in the wild, who was this hairy wild man, now receives the funeral of a king. And then Gilgamesh starts wandering around. He starts wandering around, the text says, in a lion's skin. And he's wandering around in search for eternal life. In tablet 10, then, he finally finds Utnapishtim. And Utnapishtim is the survivor of the great flood. Utnapishtim is essentially a figure like Noah in the Hebrew Bible, who survives a flood that is brought by the gods and that was supposed to extinguish all humanity. Utnapishtim survives and he receives eternal life from the gods. But he is supposed to be the exception. He is the only one who will ever receive eternal life. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that he will not get eternal life. That Gilgamesh will not get eternal life. He tells him the whole story of the flood and how the gods decided that Utnapishtim would receive eternal life, but that nobody else will get it. And Gilgamesh can simply forget it. That is Utnapishtim's message. You will not get eternal life. But Utnapishtim adds something else to his message. Not only will you not get eternal life, this whole quest is stupid. This whole quest makes no sense at all. You are walking around in a lion's skin, but you are a king. You should wear your regal mantle, and you should be a king to your people. That is what you are supposed to do. Not only will you not receive eternal life, you are supposed to play the role that has been given to you. That is Utnapishtim's message there. And so Gilgamesh goes back to Uruk, and the story ends. I find that very interesting. We are told in the introduction that Gilgamesh is so wise. Now all through these 11 tablets, we never see him doing one wise thing. Right? He fights monsters that he is not supposed to fight. He insults Inanna. He goes on this journey to find eternal life and then gets yelled at by Utnapishtim. He doesn't do anything that is wise. And there the story ends. And so the suggestion really is that after coming back to Uruk, Gilgamesh becomes this very wise king. But the story never really tells us that. It's very much suggested to us, but it's never made explicit. And I really like that. That is beautiful, I think. I find the Gilgamesh epic a very unusual and interesting and complex and moving text. So what about death? Death, the Gilgamesh epic seems to say, is inevitable. Death is irreversible. And in order to deal with death, you should fulfill the role that you have been given. You should do what you are supposed to do. And you should enjoy life in the way that you can enjoy it. Now, once you summarize the message of a very complex literary text in this way, it becomes sort of flat and pedestrian. But the text is anything but flat or pedestrian. It's a very interesting, moving, and complex text. Now, we've seen a couple of examples of literary text that talk about death and afterlife. And it's interesting that the message of these texts seems to be delivered by figures who contradict it. So Inanna does come back from the netherworld. And Utnapishtim does escape death. And Gilgamesh does not fulfill his role as king. All of these things are delivered to us in negative messages. And I think that is really interesting. I want to turn now from literary text to administrative text. And I want to do that because literary texts always leave us in doubt. Like, this is a beautiful story, but does that beautiful story really represent the way people of that time were thinking about death and afterlife? That is a hard question to ask, and I really do not have an answer to that. With administrative text, we actually do know that this was delivered and that was done because it is recorded for some particular reason. Let's look at some examples. Or let's look at one example rather. This is, by the way, a very unusual administrative text. It's dated to approximately 2046 BCE, the time of Amaseen, king of the city of Ur by that time. We have, from this particular period, we have approximately 100,000 administrative text, an enormous mass of text, which means that we often know tiny details about this period. In this case, this is an administrative text that talks about deliveries for a priestess, a high priestess, called Geme Lama. And there are food deliveries that are listed in this text for 3 different occasions. The first occasion is the wailing at her residence. The second occasion is wailing at her mortuary chapel. And the third occasion is food that is placed in her grave. It's sort of interesting to see what kinds of food are delivered to Geme Lama. I'll read to you that first section, the food delivery for wailing in her residence. We get 2 liters of ghee, a kind of butter, 1/3 of a liter of honey, 4 liters of good dates, 4 liters of cheese, 4 liters of dried gepar fruit. Unfortunately, we do not really know what kind of fruit that is. 4 liters of dried apples, 4 liters of dried grapes, 4 liters of pomegranate, and 2 strings of figs, 6 cubit long, like that. 2 allocated food portions wailing in the living room and the bedroom. At the second occasion that is listed here, the wailing at her mortuary chapel, we get exactly the same amounts of the same foodstuffs. And at the third occasion, placed in her grave, we get again the same foodstuffs, but now half the amount. What does that mean? Well, first of all, these foods are really luxury foods. We have thousands and thousands of food allocations from this particular period, and nearly always food allocations consist of grain and beer, and that's it. So food allocations that consist of fruit are very unusual and probably very expensive. Now, second, presumably the first 2 deliveries are for 2 meals each, because it seems to say something like that, 2 allocated food portions. But still, 4 liters of pomegranate, 2 liters of pomegranate per meal, that is a lot. That is a lot to deal with. Now, are these deliveries only for the dead person herself? Or are these deliveries for the people wailing for her? That kind of questions an administrative text will actually not answer. Because this is indeed an administrative text, that is, it simply tells you how much did we spend, right? And who in the end ate all of this stuff, the text doesn't care about. The last section, the food that is placed in her grave, that is clear enough. That is for Geme Lama herself. It's placed in her grave, so that's it. But it's very well possible that at least some of the food deliveries on the earlier two occasions were also for the people who were wailing for her. So what we can do with a text like this is we can sort of reconstruct different stages in the funeral of this lady. So presumably this goes over 3 days. On the first day we are still in her own house. In the second day we are at her funeral chapel, and in the third day she has actually been buried. We know from this same text that there were expenditures for making a hearse. So they clearly carried her from her house to the funerary chapel in a kind of wagon, in a hearse. So literary texts are interesting because they tell us a story and they paint an image that has all kinds of details to it. But we always question what is the connection between this literary text and the reality on the ground. Administrative texts have a very strong connection between reality and the text, but they leave us so many gaps that we have to imagine what is actually going on here. What is the plan behind all of this? What the texts do seem to illustrate is that even after death, you will need food, right? There is something going on after death, where you do not only need food, but where you need very luxury food. In other words, after death, there is still a difference between an elite person and an ordinary person. A high priestess is clearly very much an elite person, and so she gets elite foods in her grave, which means that even after her death in the netherworld, she can be fed properly as an elite person. These kinds of differences do not stop at death. Finally then, I wanted to come back to the two important grave sites that I talked about early in this presentation. We've talked about evidence from literary text, we've talked about evidence from administrative text, we also have evidence from archaeology. As I mentioned earlier, these rich grave sites are rare in Mesopotamia. We essentially have two of them, one in the city of Ur, over here, and one in the Assyrian city of Nimrud over there. This one dated to around 2500 BCE, and those dated to the 9th and 8th century BCE. The royal tombs of Ur were excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley starting in 1922. This is one of the most famous graves that he found. This is the actual burial chamber, and here in this area there are a variety of people. And here is a wagon with oxen who pulled that wagon. And you see an artist's impression of what that may have looked like here. What it means is that in the main burial chamber, a king or some very important person was buried, and that all of the people who are laying around here are essentially his attendants who were killed at the occasion of his burial. That is very exceptional. We do not know about killing people for the burial of a king from any other period in Mesopotamian history. But in this particular set of graves, that is actually going on all the time. So some of the people here are carrying weapons, and those weapons were found in the grave, which presumably means that even in death, you need that as a dead king. You need people to defend you. This is another one of those large graves. In this case, we do not see the actual burial chamber. What we see here are the attendants, the dead attendants. This is a group of 68 women, and these 68 women were singers and musicians. We know that because some of their musical instruments are right here. Those are lyres and harps. And here, right at the entrance, we have a group of 6 men with their weapons. So again, you need apparently entertainment in death, and you need the armed man to defend you. Here we have the entrance to one of these tombs. And this is perhaps one of the most famous objects that was found. It was found actually in this particular chamber. So this is a group of a number of lyres and harps, and one of them is this. Now, oh, excuse me. Now you can imagine that the harp was not found like this, right? This has been reconstructed. But it was possible to reconstruct a harp because we have images of what a harp like that looks like. Here you see a harp with a bull's head over there. Now these images are actually found on the harp itself. So this here is the same as this here. So interestingly, you find animals who are playing the harp and animals who are bringing food offerings here. Some people have interpreted that as coming from sort of an upside-down world. So the netherworld is an upside-down world where animals play music and bring food offerings. And these are just, some of the, thank you, these are some of the very beautiful and rich gifts that were given to the dead king. The other set of graves then is from Nimrud, from the Neo-Assyrian period, and we know that they are graves of Neo-Assyrian queens. They were excavated by an Iraqi team starting in 1989. These queens are buried in the women's quarters of the palace at Nimrud. And that is probably a common thing, that is the family is buried under the house. And the women's quarters of the palace is the equivalent of the house where you live. The kings were not buried there. The kings were buried in Assur itself, because that is the holy city, and the king is supposed to create a link between human beings and the gods. So the kings are buried in Assur, but the queens are buried under their house, as all people are supposed to be buried under the house. In a few cases we have inscriptions that tell us who is being buried here. So in this case we know this is the grave of Mulissa Mukanishat Ninua, and he was the queen of Ashurnasirpal, the mother of Salmaneser, and this is in the 9th century. Now, these graves also yielded incredibly beautiful ornaments, jewelry, and a gold jug, and all kinds of beautiful things. When the Iraq War started in 2003, all of this material, all of this treasure, was in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. And as you may remember, one of the scary things that happened at the beginning of that war was that the museum in Baghdad was plundered, and that many items left the museum. And so many people were sort of anxious to know what happened to the Nimrud treasure. A few months later, we learned that the Nimrud treasure was taken by museum employees and was brought to a bank vault. And in the summer of 2003, we learned that the whole Nimrud treasure was actually safe. The bank vault was found underwater, but the vault itself, the treasure itself, was safe. So it is returned to the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, and everything is there. That takes me to the end of this presentation. We've looked at the literature, we've looked at the administration, we've looked at the archaeological material. Thank you very much for your attention.